three main elements. The first is to be the climate neutral continent by 2050. The second is to make sure that we make the best use of digital technologies in all its breadth. And thirdly, that we make sure that we have an economy that works for people, that people feel included in their societies and they see that the economy is working for them. When we were hit by the corona virus, that, of course, was an unprecedented crisis. People lost their lives. It has been a very tragic and very hard period of time. And then followed with an economic crisis. And we've seen the downturn in the European economy. So we had to consider what to do. But the thing was that why would you rebuild the old world when we wanted a new one? So we have put sort of the recovery into our strategic framework to say we will recover green and digital by creating societies that really works for people. And those sort of twin transitions, green and digital, will be the job creator in the years to come. Already now, member states have agreed on the support of 540 billion euros. They are operational on a support program for short-term unemployment. And now the Commission has tabled a recovery and long-term budget of a total of 1.18 trillion euros front-loaded in the coming years. And that is indeed coming from a very strong realization that Europe can only recover strong and fast if we recover together. So we will put in motion both sort of economics and regulation that will push for green, but also when it comes to digital to make most of European assets. And they, of course, comes from the very strong sort of manufacturing core, because the business to business technology is an overlooked talent, virtue, assets of the European economy, realizing, of course, that in some of the digital areas, it has not been Europe's finest moments. And one of the reasons of that is that we haven't pushed a single market, which is why the push for a single market in all its dimension, both for goods, services, and indeed digital services, that is also the core of our economic strategy for the years to come.
That's a perfect jumping off point to my follow-up question. The Atlantic Council has a paper out on the search for digital sovereignty. I think you prefer a word like autonomy, although they're kind of overlapping concepts. I was wondering, can you clarify how the EU sees itself being able to innovate in that sort of way in terms of policy or also in the industry without messing up the apolitical role of competition policy, which you're still in charge of, and nor the provision of a level playing field for every company that wants to come to Europe, because there are tensions there with those ideas, I think.
Yes, indeed. First, to be autonomous, for me, that means that you have choices. You can choose what kind of society you want to be, what kind of economy you want to be. European member states, they are welfare states. Universal healthcare, universal access to education, a social safety net. We have a social market economy, so the regulator, the legislator, the democracy plays quite a role when it comes to making sure that we have decent working condition, environmental legislation, all of that. But the paradox, of course, is that we have been able to make those choices because of prosperity, because we can afford it. And that prosperity comes from openness. Europe is the preferred trading partner for the entire world, 80 countries in particular, the world's biggest trading bloc. So obviously, we would want to balance sort of this idea of pushing for autonomy while still being open. So we will coin this as an open strategic autonomy, also to say that we focus on a number of areas. And indeed, your question is very good. But the thing is, of course, that actually fair competition a level playing field will help us do that, because businesses that are challenged, they will be innovative. Businesses that know that competitors can produce maybe better prices, maybe more innovative products, they will do their best. And in all the value chains, of course, you need competitive prices as well. So for us, competition law enforcement is part of the recovery and is part of enabling a more assertive Europe. That being said, of course, we have a number of projects. One obvious one to mention would be the important project of common European interest on microelectronics. Sensors, things that are not produced and not available in Europe, where we will want to push innovation, but where the risk would be too big for one single company to take. So state support would come in, and many states would be engaged. Second part of that would be also such a project on batteries, where companies and member states come together, quite a lot of support, but also with an obligation to share the knowledge that is being created. So we can sort of occupy something between free and fair competition and openness, and then the transparency and the control of aid being handed out in a way that doesn't fragment the single market, because we really need that for the recovery.
Is the analogy there that those sort of projects and that level of research support, is that in some way a civilian analogy of what the US military research budget does? Do you frame it in those sorts of terms when you sit down and develop the ideas and justify it in terms of its market impacts?
Well, I think here there is a lot of sort of almost envy of DARPA and all that has been achieved with those funds and the flexibility of those funds, because I think there is a lot of room for testing, for bold ideas, for really try something new. This is not exactly the same thing. I think we have some funds that has a sort of a maybe the same sort of atmosphere to it, but we do not have the same thing as the DARPA fund. But we would want to push things in that direction, but we do not have that in full scale.
Mm-hmm. Maybe if we broaden it out a little bit now, more to geopolitics and globalization for a minute. I know you've just had the EU-China summit, and the Commission really put itself out there and said it wanted to be a geopolitical commission. I also heard some criticism. Last week I was talking with Joshua Wong, for example. He leads the protest movement in Hong Kong, and he went really quite far and said that the EU is engaging almost in appeasement policy in its stance on Hong Kong, or not taking economic action against China in that regard. But your president, Ursula von der Leyen, she says human rights are non-negotiable. You've done an investment screening tool. So I was wondering, who's right there? Is Joshua Wong entitled to be frustrated at the EU on China?
Well, that of course is difficult for me to judge, because he's in a very difficult situation and very specific situation. If you heard the president, our president, yesterday in the press point after the summit, I think you would agree with me that this was a very assertive president. It has been a summit that followed after we a year ago made the EU-China strategy. Where we once and for all sort of retired the idea that China is a developing economy. China is a partner, for instance, on climate change, fighting that, but also a strategic competitor, both when it comes to the market and economics, but also when it comes to the system. And I think that came clearly across in the summit. The press point was a clear reflection of the debates during the summit. For me, this is very important because we ask, for instance, to give you an example, we ask businesses in Europe to compete fair and square on the merits of their products, quality, affordable prices, innovation, without taxpayers picking up their bills. Which is why, of course, it's important that if they have competitors in Europe that comes with foreign subsidies, for their production costs, for their investment, that is uncontrolled, unchecked, with no transparency, well, we would want to have tools to make that transparent, to see if that's on balance serves European interests. And I think that's a very good way of saying we take it from the rhetorics and try to be operational, to have the right tool to say we want to push fair competition, but for all of those businesses who compete fair and square, we also stand up for them if they are faced with unfair competition.
Mm-hmm. It does indeed seem very much that the globalization that we knew in recent decades is under threat, and that it requires more of a joining up of your policy work with other policy areas to make sure that the whole thing doesn't fall apart, let's say. And I know that there are more governments and more people afraid of the rise of China there. How do you see competition policy fitting into all of those other political needs and that need for a holistic response to those globalization threats?
Well, the strength of competition law enforcement is of course that it builds on the rule of law, that we are always responsible to the courts, that we have a case law, that we have equal treatment principles, and that we never, ever compromise on those. So obviously there are strict limits as to how competition policy as such can be a tool when it comes to geopolitics. But to be competitive for businesses who grow, who scale up here, fair competition for them is a tool in their scale up. I think there is an example after the Great Depression in the US, where competition laws were relaxed or paused. And later there was a recognition of the fact that had actually delayed the recovery after the Great Depression. And I think that's a good example of why a vigilant competition law enforcement is a benefit in itself, to make you competitive, to make sure that you are aware that you are being challenged. So in that respect, of course, it's important. And the second thing is that competition law enforcement will have to be in its time. We have an ongoing, very intense debate about competition law enforcement in a digital era, because markets are changing. The market's dynamics, they're different. They are faster. You have marginal prices approaching zero. You have network effect. You have the data-driven economy. So, of course, we need to change with the times that we're in. But we will not negotiate and we will not compromise on this being built on the rule of law and the responsibility for the courts in order to make sure that we have equal treatment between businesses.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's another really important part of your work around state aid and dealing with those government subsidies. And here in the US, there is a vigorous debate around how to be transparent around bailout money. There's trillions now sloshing around in all of these short-term measures to make sure the economy doesn't collapse. I was wondering, how worried are you that some companies or other vested interests might misuse these short-term protections to essentially save themselves when they don't need to be saved or can't be saved, and where they're not actually delivering the social outcomes that were intended? And what's your role in making sure that doesn't happen?
Here we have a shared responsibility with member states. We say that businesses cannot be helped if they were in difficulty before the COVID crisis, the corona crisis hit us. But if they have issues, if they lose their business, well, they can have some kind of compensation also if in difficulty, so they have a fair chance of recovering. The important thing here is, of course, that sort of the temporary framework of rules is indeed temporary, and that the different schemes that we are approving, that they have sunset clauses. Where it really bites is when we go into recapitalization of businesses. Businesses who may not anymore have market access and who need new capital. Those, of course, have to be healthy, well-run, viable businesses. Otherwise, there is a risk, of course, that taxpayers will lose their money. And taxpayer money will have to come with strings attached. Mm-hmm. So if you go in and recapitalize a business with taxpayers' money, that comes with the consequence of a ban of bonuses of senior management, acquisition bans, dividend bans if it's a full state recapitalization, in order for the business to have an incentive to push out the state again. And of course, also, if these are big businesses in a dominant position, that there will be remedies for potential disturbance of competition. And that is because it's a difficult, it's a different thing to have taxpayers' money sitting as capital compared to providing liquidity. And this is, of course, why we are much more precise and attach many more strings if it is capital rather than liquidity. But also just saying that in a situation like this, of course, member states should support their businesses. Member states are closing down economies, closing the doors of businesses. Of course, there is a responsibility to make sure that those businesses can survive when it's a government decisions that deprive them of customers.
Does that turn you into the bad cop? I was trying to think of the analogy. Are you the bad cop here or the overworked triage nurse who's trying to fix all of these endless messes?
I think you should leave both those occupations to the real thing, at least out of respect of the hardworking nurse.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I want to remind everyone watching, you can pose questions in the Q&A function, and we're going to start getting to them in just a couple of minutes. You're almost through with me, Commissioner. Now, when it comes to the big tech companies, sometimes you're criticized for being anti-American. I'll push back on that. I don't think that's true. I think it's just that a lot of the big tech companies happen to be American. So that's my 2 cents there. But what we have certainly seen from this pandemic is that those companies are the big winners from the pandemic. And they certainly are the most able to have creative tax strategies as well, for example. And it feels like all of that is coming to a head in social and political terms. If we think back to 2008, it was that the banks were too big to fail, and then the bill was sent to the taxpayers. And somehow it's almost like now the big tech companies are too big to compete against because they've got this huge head of steam. And, you know, if you're a small player, you know, they'll just buy you or copy you. And, you know, they're so big, they don't need to necessarily innovate in the way that a more populated marketplace would. So I'll stop there, but how much of that does that worry you? And have you got things in your toolbox where you're going to try and address that in coming years?
Well, first, I think very positively, the cooperation during the COVID crisis has been good. For instance, to make sure that people see information from trusted sources if they're looking for information on Corona, COVID-19. I think that has been very good. But one of the things that has been clear to me during these times is that it's a matter of urgency, that the market is open for entrepreneurs, for scale-ups, for people with new ideas, because we're not at the last chapter of digitization. I think we're only getting started. And that is, of course, why it is so important that not only that, of course, I do my job to vigorously enforcing competition law, but also that we get more sort of ex-ante regulation to spell out clearly what is the responsibility that you have if you are a digital gatekeeper, and how to prevent markets from tipping. Because we see that competition, not just in the market for a market share, but basically to own that market and be the private regulator. And that is, of course, perfectly fine if the private regulator set rules for fair competition. But we have seen, not in one, not in two, but in 3 Google cases, in the first Amazon case, we see that this is not the case. We have just opened 2 Apple cases, one on Apple Pay, one on the App Store, where there's competition between Apple services and other services. So, you know, we need to combine for the market to remain open, because we need that drive for innovation. And that I find to be a matter of urgency. We regulate, of course, the European market, but it is an encouragement to see, for instance, how how the European legislation on privacy has inspired a global debate about how to make sure that people can be private. And I think that is crucial, because in these years when we see all the potential of technology, we should make sure that we create trust, that people trust the technology, because otherwise we risk a backslash, and we risk that people say, not so much, this is not for me. So I think sometimes people underestimate that there is a positive side to regulation as well, both when it comes to market opening and when it comes to creating trust among consumers.
I was talking to Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, last week, and he said that he'd learned a lot, and Microsoft had learned a lot from its tangles with your predecessors at the European Commission. Do you feel that the other companies you've been dealing with have been going on that learning journey, or do you think there's anything they can learn from a company like Microsoft, or do you find yourself stuck in a rut where you feel like a broken record, repeating the same messages and rules back at some of these companies?
It's very difficult to say, because the companies are very different. It may be so that they are called the GAFAs as one, but they are indeed very different. They are different in their culture, in their leadership. The thing that they have in common is that they are really giants. But that being said, they are different. But of course, to some degree, I worry that we did not have one Google case. We had not two, we had three. We've had one Amazon case. Now we have a new one, and we unfortunately had to open not one Apple case but two. So at least there is, I think, still a learning potential.
Yeah, I got one last tough one before we move to the audience questions. I'm thinking back to when you fined Facebook in 2017 for providing false information in their earlier merger before your time between Facebook and WhatsApp. And now Facebook's moving ahead to merge data that it had promised it wouldn't merge between its big services. I'm just wondering, would you like the power to rescind merger approvals like that when you see acts sort of years down the line that were out of step with the requirements you put on the decision?
Well, that is a very specific situation, because actually the services back then, they did the analysis that even though Facebook said we will not and we cannot merge the data from WhatsApp and Facebook, the services, they did the analysis anyway. What if they did? Would that be a competition problem? And back then they found that no, that would not be the case. So in that respect, of course, as you say, we fined them because it turned out that they had been given us false information. But I think on substance, this would not be a case for sort of unscrambling the eggs. And it is indeed very difficult to unscramble the eggs. What we want to push is indeed that when we have an antitrust case, we have three different elements in a decision. One is the fine to punish past illegal behavior. Then there is the cease and desist decision. Stop what you're doing. Don't put anything with the same effect in place. And then thirdly, sort of the recovery of competition, how to make competition come back. And this is indeed still work in progress. Of course, we haven't seen the effect of the Android preference menu because very few Android phones have been shipped due to the COVID crisis, but remains to be seen if when Google is pre-installed after the untying and other services can be chosen, will that work? Will that sort of open the market for others search and browsers than the Google choices?
Now we shift to the audience questions. So this one does come from Brussels, I think, and it was a request to hear a little bit about your relationship with your colleague Thierry Breton, the EU Single Market Commissioner, because it is said that he makes a loud case for changing competition rules and allowing some exceptions to them, and your job is to defend the open market. So I think the questioner wants to know whether you split the difference on some of these issues, or whether he lets you have your space and you let him have his space, and you sort of work in those arrangements.
Well, it's not really so that we just can say you do your thing, I do mine, because the Commission works as a collegium. We work together, and I have the responsibility for also sort of making sure that things fit together. This is the point of being the vice president. Um, but the thing is, we have a very good cooperation because his mission to make sure that the single market work is, of course, of the essence. One of the reasons why we have US giants here, we have China's giant coming in, is of course they have a single market to grow. They could scale within a single market. So one of the things that we really truly share is for the single market to work in full. I very much admire the work being done on the Single Market Enforcement Task Force that is now being started with member states to take every registered barrier down to make sure that the single market really works. So no, I think we're based definitely on the same page, even though we come from different responsibilities.
Muted. We got a question from Leo Schrenk, who's the former CEO at Swift. And his question is, what do you think of the US suspension of negotiations on a digital services tax? What's the next step or the way forward? And I think that's a reference to the OECD process, where we have heard that everyone else agrees within the G20 and the US is the outlier there.
Well, obviously, I very, very much regret this. I think it was a small comfort that the withdrawal was accompanied with wording to suggest that one was still on board one way or another to have a global consensus, because we would really, really prefer a global consensus on the question of digital taxation. Because we find it so difficult to defend to the many, many, many businesses all over the world who pay their taxes, that they have to see that competitors for capital, for skilled employees, for customers, that they do not pay their taxes. So I do hope that one way or another we can still move this forward, because it is really the best thing if we could have a global consensus and then implement that in the different jurisdictions, rather than us here within Europe having to push this on our own. Of course, our president have asked us to do so if we need to, so we would of course do that, but it would be the absolute preferable situation that we could have a consensus about these issues.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question from Michael Acton now, and it's a state aid question. And so he's asking about Germany's notification of a 100 billion euro recapitalization scheme at the end of March. And he'd like to know why the Commission hasn't approved that yet. Is it out of a concern that Germany is already spending too much compared to other member states?
We do not have a concern that Germany spends too much, because in state aid terms with these legal bases, you can only spend what is justified. You cannot sort of pop up businesses with subsidies. We have been very busy with a number of different schemes, also individual notifications for recapitalization, the Lufthansa case being the most obvious one, where there is agreement. So it's not the size of the scheme. I don't know why we're not completely done with it, but it's not for any sort of matters of principle. But it's a good illustration of the fact that some can do a lot and is needed to do a lot, and they can do it, but others may not be able to do the same thing, even though it may be needed. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important for us that the next generation EU recovery plan is approved one way or another by heads of state and government. And one of the things there that I really hope that they will endorse is what we call the solvency support instrument, which is an instrument to crowd in private investment to businesses who need to redo their capital, and to target this instrument to businesses and member states who do not have the same sort of fiscal muscle as you would find in Germany.
Mhm. Understood. Now, I'm going to combine several questions. We've been getting quite a few in on China. And so they essentially revolve around how you see the role of Chinese investment in Europe, but they refer to different policies and different projects. And so I guess it's about how anti-subsidy proposals complement your work in competition policy. And the sort of examples given are Chinese financing of the Budapest to Belgrade railway, which one anonymous questioner said is a clear violation of competition rules. So a general reaction to how you're going to play the China situation.
Well, we do hope, of course, that the white paper on foreign subsidy will be preferred reading globally, so that people see our intentions. What we want to do is actually three different things. First, if you want to acquire a European business, you have to notify if you are subsidized to do so. And then we can figure out on balance, is this good or bad? Does it serve European interest? If you fail to do so, of course, there are repercussions, because the second part of the instrument is a sort of universal market tool. If we see here, get complaints about subsidies, that we can, in a two-step procedure, say, well, this is not how things were supposed to be. You have to share what you got from the subsidy. And then the third element, which is very important, that in public procurement, if bids are being subsidized, that they can be excluded, maybe once or maybe for a longer period of time, in order to have fair competition also in public procurement. Because businesses are asked to do their best on quality, on prices, on how they deliver. And it should indeed be on substance and not be a competition about who has the best access to foreign taxpayers. The second thing is sort of the screening of foreign direct investment, where the first things here, they are directed towards competition. The screening of foreign direct investment is directed to issues of public order and security. And then, of course, the modernized trade defenses that we can do if we see that goods may be subsidized outside of Europe and then dumped on the European market. I think it's very important to be vigilant now. And the reason why we push this so decisively is that we will not sacrifice fair competition and the benefits that comes with it, of affordable prices, of innovation, of good services. We will fight the unfair competition, because otherwise, of course, the risk is that we just launch a grotesque subsidy race. And that doesn't make the most efficient use of resources, and it definitely do not serve customers and consumers well.
Mm-hmm. We've got some more questions about Chinese policy innovation and whether you'd be open to certain ideas. So I'll just throw two of them at you. One is from Sigrid Johannisa, who's a Dutch policy advisor. And she asked, is restricting global high-tech exports to China a good way to mitigate risks and change behavior? And then the other point is around fair competition in the media space, which is notoriously hard to regulate, and people get in trouble when they try to. But the point this person is making is that Chinese media have free access to what the West provides, whether it's platforms and its media. But European, Western internet platforms, media outlets don't get a fair shot in China. So is that something that can be dealt with by the EU at any point in its policymaking?
I wouldn't know about the timing. Where we have found that it was a real big problem, and I do take sort of the tone in this question, that there is a huge problem of reciprocity, and we find that as well which is why the Commission has tabled a proposal. That proposal is targeted procurement. It's called the International Procurement Instrument. And the idea here is to say you're more than welcome to do business in Europe, but we would also want to be welcome to do business with you. Where I grew up in the western part of Denmark, if you invite people over and they don't invite you back, eventually you stop inviting. And I think we need to push for reciprocity also outside of procurement, because market access and for that to work both ways is indeed of the essence. And as said, the European rules should go with everyone, and we do indeed see more and more of the Chinese digital giants being part of the European market.
It's nearly time to wrap up, so maybe I'll throw in one question, because we didn't actually talk about the state of the Transatlantic Alliance, and I know you're a passionate supporter of that. Could you give us a scorecard or a sentiment ranking of where you see the alliance as being at right now, and what, if anything, would you like to see changed in the coming months and years?
We share so fundamental values. We have such a long history together. And right now, we are not making best use of that value of sharing fundamentals and having a common history in a world that is changing so dramatically. Because the geopolitics today are so different as to what they were just 5-10 years ago. And I would really wish for the US-EU relationship to be stronger. A good expression of that is the proposal that my colleague Phil Hogan has made to establish a US-EU Trade and Technology Council, to have a structured place to discuss this and to push for common approaches. The idea of open liberal democracies is being challenged these years, also systemically, and that I think we should confront together, because in that we would be so much stronger. So with the background, with the values, I think we have much to do to make much better use of that potential in a world that is so much more challenging than what it was.
Margrethe Vestager, it's hard to overstate the influence that you do have in EU policy circles. So we really appreciate that you've taken the time to elevate this conversation and answer the questions in such depth. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm now going to turn it over to Benjamin Haddad, who is the director of the Atlantic Council's Future Europe Initiative, for some wrap-up remarks. Thanks again.
Could I just say thank you to you? I really appreciate the way this conversation has been moderated. So thank you very much for your effort.
A pleasure.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the director of the Future Europe Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this 9th Atlantic Council front page conversation. Thank you, Ryan, for a great job at moderating, and thanks to our friends at Politico for sharing this event. But really, thank you, Madam Executive Vice President, for your leadership on one of Europe's most important portfolio, especially in this time of crisis. And thank you for taking the time to speak to our audience today in the United States and in Europe. The Atlantic Council is founded on the mission that the United States is stronger with its allies. As we face an unprecedented economic crisis, health crisis, as our societies are reckoning on both sides of the Atlantic with issues of race and identity, the risk of looking inward has never been greater. And this is why at the Atlantic Council, these last few months, we've gone on offense, keeping our friends and allies close and making the case for our common values and the need to shape a rules-based order. And the relationship with the European Union as a core strategic partner of the United States is more than ever critical. On all the challenges that you mentioned, Madam Vice President, from dealing with new technologies to ensuring a level playing field with China, we do believe that the EU and the US are stronger together. You said it in your conclusion, we should confront those together in a world that is getting more complex. And I want to assure you that you can count on the Atlantic Council for making that case as well. In the next few weeks, we'll continue with our work, and I'd just like to mention two events to people viewing today. Our next AC front page event will be tomorrow, Wednesday, June 24th at 9:30 a.m. For the United States, with Germany's Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, that you know as AKK. And on Thursday, the 25th, we will launch our new paper, The EU and the Search for Digital Sovereignty, Building Fortress Europe or Preparing for a New World. This paper is co-signed by our FEI Senior Fellows Fran Burwell and Ken Propp. You can find the paper on our website and join us for the conversation at 10:30 a.m. on Thursday with the member of the European Parliament, Axel Voss, Rupert Schlegemish, who is the Director for Trade at the European Commission, Ken Propp and Fran Burwell, and Ambassador Karen Batia, VP at Google. That will be on Thursday morning. Join us for these two events, and thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Madam Vice President. And with this, have a great day, everyone.
Likewise. Bye-bye.